Hello. Welcome to the weekly question and answer session. I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today, as usual, I'll start with a brief preview or review of the two videos that were released or re-released in the last week, and then I'll be open for questions. The questions can be on those videos. They can be on other ADHD topics or other mental health questions topics. I will also do a shout out that there's a Reddit subreddit channel, station, thread, whatever we call it, if that's a better venue for asking questions and answers. It's under Dr. John Kruse. And I'll also do other little announcements. One is subscriptions to this YouTube channel have surpassed 10,000. So that's some sort of milestone. So thank you for being here and thank you for asking good questions. And two is that I was interviewed on the Huberman podcast that came out a week ago Monday, and more than 100,000 people viewed that. So that's gratifying. So the other disclaimer is that everything I'm saying here, I've tried to research, I try to be thoughtful, but I am not making specific medical recommendations here. I don't have a doctor-patient relationship. I don't know all your history of what's gone on or family history or what you've tried and how well it's worked. So information here is for general purposes and to take back to your treatment team with hopefully suggestions if you need suggestions. So the two videos released this past week, one was on Buspirone and ADHD, and the other one was on ADHD kills. So Buspirone is a drug that's approved by the FDA for anxiety. It works slowly, like antidepressants work slowly. It is a pretty clean and simple, it's not completely clean. Clean in drug sense means acting only on one receptor system. So its primary action is a serotonin 1A partial agonist. So it binds the receptor and partially acts like serotonin would at that receptor. That also seems to be not just helpful for anxiety, but for depression. A related drug called Buspirone, after 20 years of FDA battles, finally got approved as an antidepressant in the last year. So presumably Buspirone does have some antidepressant actions as well, and it's widely used as an add-on agent if you have an SSRI that's not working as well. But there is a little bit of data looking at it for ADHD and finding benefits. It's certainly not a first or even a second tier choice, but very low rates of side effects. Occasionally, some people do have problems with it. And what else was I going to say about it? That's maybe someone will jog my memory or something else interesting will come. Other than its serotonin 1A, it does have some action on dopamine 2 autoreceptors, so it could be affecting dopamine levels that way. The second video was on ADHD kills. So there was a study done in Britain, an actuarial study looking at actual deaths of people diagnosed from their medical records with ADHD, finding that men on average were living, I think, about 7 years shorter than their non-ADHD peers. And with women, ADHD cut 9 years off their life. Other studies, it made a lot of news, although I would argue in some sense it shouldn't have, in that this is not surprising or novel. Russell Barkley did a study, I think it's 2018. There they just looked at risk factors and put them into an actuarial table. So the fact that people with ADHD are more likely to be smoking, people with ADHD are more likely to be in car accidents, X, Y, and Z. To find similar results at almost a decade of life lost if you have an ADHD diagnosis. The majority of those deaths seem to be from either accidents or suicides, and that's particularly the major causes of death in young people in industrialized country. Those are two of the top three potential causes of death. And it sort of cuts against two different narratives. One is that ADHD is only or purely a superpower and a wonderful thing. I would agree that it is a form of neurodiversity and that it's part of what makes people who have it unique or special or contributes to that. But in terms of those individuals fitting in with our society as our society is currently constructed, it has some substantial disadvantages, early death being one of them. So I can certainly talk more about that, but I do see there's some questions. Actually, before I go to the questions here, I will answer. So occasionally people type in questions and they show up in the emails I get connected to the YouTube channel, but they aren't on the YouTube comments section. Happens 1 out of about 20 comments. And I don't know if that means the person's revoked or decided to ask a question and then released it or erased it, or whether it's just getting lost in our wonderful technological systems. But Bucephalos Alexandros asked a question about milnacipran. It was on the Cymbalta seed or Cymbalta video, asking, could you just use milnacipran? Milnacipran in the U.S. is marketed as Savella as an antidepressant. No, Vetsima as an antidepressant, and Savella only as a drug for treating chronic fatigue myositis syndrome. But the active ingredient is milnacipran, and one, it's just the stereoisomer. So we have in the US 3 different serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. We have Effexor. We also have Pristique, which is a breakdown product of Effexor. We have Cymbalta, which is duloxetine, and we have milnacipran. And as you go from venlafaxine, which is some Effexor, through these, you're getting more and more relative norepinephrine reuptake. So milnacipran should be actually a better ADHD agent than is duloxetine, and should be a better ADHD agent than should be Effexor. There are studies on all 3 of these products being effective. Some people don't notice much difference between the 3, and some are exquisitely sensitive to the balance between serotonin and norepinephrine. So I've actually had 2 different people. So again, Effexor venlafaxine is almost well over 10 times stronger on serotonin than on reuptake than on norepinephrine. Duloxetine we consider more balanced, although most neurochemical assays suggest it is stronger on serotonin than on norepinephrine reuptake. And milnacipran's the other direction, more strong on norepinephrine reuptake than serotonin. So again, the norepinephrine reuptake seems more pertinent to ADHD. As I was about to say, I've had some individuals who actually, what worked best for them was combining Vetsima and duloxetine, and the pharmacist would say, oh, those 2 drugs do the exact same thing. Why are you prescribing both? And it was, if they were on just Vetsima, they felt too revved up, too wiry, which is a norepinephrine effect. If they were on just Cymbalta, duloxetine, they felt too numbed out, too placid, and we needed to titrate that sort of precise norepinephrine to serotonin reuptake ratio. So I've seen that more than once, where either those 2 options were too extreme, and combining the 2 in a particular ratio put the person at an optimal spot for help with depression, anxiety, and sometimes with focus without revving them up too much. So that was a good question, and I will jump to thanks, Max. So Max has included the link to the Huberman interview. And my understanding, if you don't want to sit through the whole 2.5-hour discussion, there are also some smaller videos with special segments that Huberman Labs has released about this. So Dennis has asked, can light stimulate the pineal gland through the skin? I'm curious because an osteopath said that our skin has photoreceptors and this can explain some instances of nocturnal awakenings. So even though my PhD was on related circadian rhythms, I am not completely current with all this, but I think there's some mixing and confusing of a few different things. So the major circadian rhythm generator, the master clock, as it were. So we have multiple clocks, which some of them can develop their own independent clock timing properties, but that are in mammals and in birds, the major clock is a suprachiasmatic nucleus. Chiasm is X, supra is above X. So they're sitting right above where the optic nerves cross and go into the brain at the bottom of the hypothalamus. So that circadian clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, direct retinal input. So there are special receptors in the back of your eye, the retina, that go, and those fibers jump off right at the optic chiasm rather than going back into the thalamus and then going back into the optical visual cortex. So it's a shorter, more direct link. So the circadian clock in humans gets visual input through retinal input. And one of the studies I like to talk about most, because I was involved in the early 80s and early studies of winter depression for treating bright light used to treat winter depression. One of the early questions was, is this just light exposure to the skin that's making people better, or is it to the retinas or the eyes? And they swathed some individuals in burqas, but had their eyes open when they were sitting under these bright white lights, and they had others in bikinis with goggles over their eyes to see. And it was the group who had retinal exposure to the light that got a positive antidepressant effect from bright light for their winter depression. So most of the and it's also why blue light from your PDA, your phone, your other devices can trigger or can prevent falling asleep if you're being exposed light at night, and why they've put in blue light filters in some of these devices. So in reptiles and some other species, the pineal gland probably has a more, so in humans and rodents, other mammals, the pineal gland seems mostly a secondary serotonin at a very clear circadian rhythm, but that clock mechanism is primarily driven through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. My understanding or recollection, and this could be wrong, so double check it, is that in reptiles and some other species, one is that the pineal gland is larger and closer to the surface and actually maybe getting light more directly through the skull. And also, so jumping in the other direction, at least one group did find some photoreceptor sensitive skin at the back of the knees, is my recollection. But I don't, again, if it's happening in humans, it's almost certainly going through the suprachiasmatic nucleus, not direct pineal. So that's what I would say. I mean, nocturnal awakenings, I'd say the largest reason for nocturnal awakenings is normal sleep architecture. So I'll get into that. And if I'm going too far or too deep, stop me. So when sleep is not just a monolithic, you hit your head on the pillow and you either fall asleep quickly or you fall asleep after a long time and stay asleep. Within sleep, we're in different stages of sleep, and there's a pattern of going through of slow wave sleep, shallow slow wave sleep, shallow or deep slow wave sleep called non-REM sleep, and then going through REM sleep. And then after the REM episodes, I may have the sequence wrong, so it's about an hour and a half to 2 hour cycle. It's not a clock-like cycle, it's a sloppier cycle, but we go to a state of awakeness where, looking at the brain, looking at the EEG, the polysomnographers cannot distinguish that from being awake. And then we're only there for a few minutes, and then we drift down back into slow wave sleep, REM sleep, alertness, but not. And we go through 4 or 5 cycles of that each night. Again, it's a sloppier clock, but it's a pretty clear pattern. So the experts would say we're actually awake 4 or 5 times a night, but if your eyes are closed, if it's dark, if there's no sound, if your bladder isn't giving you signals, then you have no awareness, and your objective finding experience at the morning is, no, I slept the whole night through. That's crazy that I was awake 3 or 4 times for a few minutes each night. But it's true and robust, and that I would argue is probably more accounting for a greater percentage of nocturnal awakenings, that it's some little thing, and it could be worries, internal generated, it could be sound, it could be in the environment, your partner snoring, a car honking. You might not even be aware of the trigger by the time you are awake and opening your eyes awake. So Max is asking, in the Buspirone video, you mentioned that too high a dose of methylphenidate can cause cognitive dulling. Why does this occur, and what does cognitive dulling feel and look like? So I'll start with the easier part of the question. So there's a universal curve that they usually teach in Psych 101 classes for alertness or with stimulation. If you get a little stimulation, most people are more alert, more awake. And if you get too much stimulation, you get flooded, you get less productive, less functional. So I would argue it's a sort of an analogy to that. Too much of a good thing can make, and I'm not sure if we even know the exact, I haven't seen, I'm not saying someone hasn't described and figure out what is going on at a neurochemical level, or what's being flooded, or what's, so that the feeling itself is going from, okay, I'm sharp and I'm focused, to now I'm losing my focus and not quite feeling sedated, but feeling more clouded, feeling more blocked. Maybe it's another term. But so, I mean, the other possibility of taking too much methylphenidate is you feel more and more and more highly overstimulated, and in fact, to the point of triggering panic and having hypertensive crises and other, too much of a stimulant can kill you. So something like an antidepressant, you can take a whole month's worth of Prozac. It's not going to kill you. It may make you sleepy and groggy, but amphetamines, methylphenidate are more dangerous, particularly for cardiac effects if they go too high. So I'm not sure if I answered that. And Max is pointing out that YouTube sometimes deletes comments for various reasons. Either they're too long, or they thought there was an inappropriate word, or think it's a bot comment. Most of the ones that I see tend to be actually well thought out, fairly detailed discussions. Someone's relating in a few sentences their experience with the dose of a drug or X, Y, or Z, and it's usually asking for appropriate thoughts or comments. So I don't think these are being censored by the algorithms. It might be that these people thought they were sharing too much and it was too much to put out there, although I didn't sense anything wrong or inappropriate, or it could be more technological glitch. And on several of them, I've used, the search function to see if that person's name or other keywords I identified in the comment are buried somewhere in the comment section, and it just hasn't helped. But Piotr Wolanin asks, why do I feel more confident and relaxed mentally after pool swimming? Other forms of exercise don't have the same effect. Is that mainly dopamine? So I'll overshare. I was a swimmer in high school. My whole family were swimmers. I was not particularly good compared to my siblings, and swam through college. Actually, our Division III, not very impressive historically swim team, the coach there was so innovative that he went on to be a coach for the coaches of the U.S. Olympic team for several years, and he developed innovative um, approaches to swimming that are still used to this day. This is 40, 30 years ago. And I have many patients who swimming is the one exercise or form of physical activity that they feel clearer, they feel relaxed, it's their happy place. I don't know how much of the physiology has been studied. I mean, dopamine, and I've talked about the stories we tell about dopamine in at least one of these videos. Dopamine has more to do with assessing rewards and the values we expect and whether we're meeting expectations. And dopamine per se is not the happy neurochemical, probably oxytocin, probably endogenous cannabinoids and anandamine. I think I got it right this time, are more related to joy, or evolutionarily, even though we as a species have developed or evolved on the savanna, most early human settlements and until the industrial age, and even still, are along cities, are along rivers, are along waterfronts. So swimming and being in the water, even though many of us in industrialized countries, inner city environments, there's certainly socioeconomic factors. Many humans now don't grow up swimming or have never been in a pool or elsewise. It probably for millions of years was something that most humans did at least occasionally and part of our evolutionary heritage. So that's the best answer I can come up with swim. So my recommendation is, if it works for you and you like it, continue it. I'd say I'll overshare more here just to be fun. Even though I was sort of coerced for family reasons into swimming, that was never my happy spot. I was more a runner, and I have run 100 marathons. So that's one of my biggest, outside of mental health, accomplishments. So James Alexander asked, how long do Strattera, Qelbree, and Wellbutrin individually take for your ADHD patients to notice their effect as a monotherapy? And how long do you wait between dosing increases? So this is one area. Some of the experts are coming around and qualifying their statements, but for at least 20 years, I felt like I was alone in the wilderness. So the experts would, in their talks, in their presentations to general audience, to professional audience, would say drugs like Wellbutrin, Strattera are working like antidepressants. We know the antidepressants are slow and indirect and take weeks to build up, and it's not the amount of drug building up in the system that's relevant. It's the mechanisms that they're secondarily engaging in the brain that take time to be working full blast. That all those agents, non-stimulants, take a long time, a few weeks to start working. This made absolutely no sense from a primary neuroscience level, which, if we're going to oversimplify, amphetamine, methylphenidate work well quickly because they are causing more dopamine and norepinephrine to be available, or to be available as a stronger signal through reuptake action immediately, within minutes to hour of them getting in the body. We know that Wellbutrin has strong dopamine norepinephrine reuptake action within an hour. We know that Strattera has strong norepinephrine reuptake action. We know that duloxetine and milnacipran have strong norepinephrine and serotonin reuptake within a few hours. So you would think, at a neuroscience point of view, they should work immediately. And if you talk to patients, they will say, oh, yes, I could tell right away. I felt more focused. And right away means within an hour or two of taking it. And I use this example because it's the most vivid one. For a while, I actually collected testimonials from patients about how quickly their non-stimulant was working. But one guy who was taking duloxetine took the pill in my office, took the underground muni to get to his workplace, was standing on the sidewalk, so maybe 45 minutes to an hour after he took the dose. And he describes it as sort of revelatory. There was a guy on a skateboard hurtling towards him on the sidewalk, and he knew in his normal ADHD state that that was one situation where he always just froze blank. He just couldn't deal with it. And with the duloxetine on board, he was able to simply step out of the way. And the way he described it was so powerful that that's the example I keep using. So these drugs absolutely work within hours for ADHD. So it's not incompatible that the same drug has direct effects on serotonin, norepinephrine that are immediate, and particularly the serotonin reuptake effects. That does not cause immediate alleviation of depression. It's probably the serotonin signal is doing something downstream that involves making new proteins, changing how nerve cells talk to each other, probably also involves making new nerve cells for its antidepressant effects. So I think part of the problem is, and I talk about this in my Strattera video, Strattera atomoxetine, most people cannot tolerate therapeutic doses. So the strategy with atomoxetine is to start really low, and it takes several weeks to build up to a level where it's having efficacy. It's not that it takes a long time to work, it's that it takes a long time for your body to tolerate a dose that's going to work. That's my explanation for Strattera. So if you could take 100 milligrams of Strattera the first day, and some people can and do, they notice the effects the first day. And so I don't know whether many of these experts don't listen to patients, don't talk to patients, or they just see them at a 3-week follow-up and they say, oh, well, how's the Wellbutrin working for you? And the patient says, oh, it's helping me focus. And then the doctor's assuming that that was a gradual online, and that's their conclusion. It took 3 weeks to work, rather than asking or double checking, how quickly and how abruptly did you notice that? Qelbree, I have less direct, excuse me. I have less direct experience with, so I have less ability to say how quickly most patients are responding to it. I would not. And there it's a little stranger. It was thought when it was marketed as an antidepressant more than 20 years ago, and it was only on the market for a few years in Britain and nowhere else, that it was primarily a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. From that rationale, you would think it would work quickly because its norepinephrine reuptake effect appeared to be quick. More subsequent studies suggest that the norepinephrine reuptake effect may not be how it's working and may only be a minor constituent, and it might have indirect effects on serotonin systems. So Qelbree, I can't give a good answer. So with Strattera, with Wellbutrin, with Cymbalta, with milnacipran, my recommendation, if you are taking it primarily for ADHD and not for depression or other reasons, would be within a day, you'll probably have a good idea of what it's doing. For many individuals, there's so much day-to-day variation in their demands on their life, on whether they slept well, how well they're functioning, that I would say give it 2 or 3 days. And if you're not seeing any effect and you're not having any side effects, then it's fine to go up. If you're having side effects, then that's a reason to sit longer at a lower dose until you've had at least a few days side effect free before going up. But it doesn't make sense to linger longer at a lower level expecting you're just going to eventually see more help for ADHD. That, in my experience and my understanding the neuroscience of it, it just doesn't make much sense. So discontinuity, took their first depression ADHD medication a day, Wellbutrin, bupropion, XL, 150 milligrams. I guess I was inspired by one of my videos, and especially about the risks of untreated ADHD was an inspiration to take ADHD seriously. So I hope it goes well for you. And maybe you can even tell us during this Q&A whether you're seeing any effects, within an hour or two of taking it. And discontinuity says that some of their ADHD symptoms either originated or were exacerbated by sleep apnea. And that sleep apnea was surgically corrected, but there was still persistence of ADHD. So I do have a talk on sleep apnea on this channel. So James Alexander's asking, are there any supplements that my ADHD patients have noticeably benefited from? So there are dozens and dozens of supplements that there are maybe one, maybe two studies, many with no studies where people are touting it as this really helps with ADHD. The things that I've seen most dramatic or impressive, I have several people who felt magnesium was quite helpful for them. And I do have a video on magnesium and I guess other metals that are used, minerals that are supplements. There's a lot of claims for fish oil, omega-3 fatty acids. I think the data for omega-3s in depression and anxiety is more robust. So there's several positive studies, but they did follow several studies that didn't find a positive impact from fish oil. I think there are there's rational reasons why fish oil may be helpful. So it's one that I have and one that's unlikely to cause adverse effects, particularly in the long run. So fish oil I'm comfortable with. Other supplements and acetylcysteine I've talked about here. There's a little bit of evidence that helps some subset of people with ADHD. There's been at least one study in Iran on saffron. I haven't seen follow-up studies. That doesn't mean they aren't there. I just haven't gone looking for them yet. What else is out there? I have a talk on theanine. I think that theanine is more caffeine. Caffeine would be a huge one. So, and nicotine. So nicotine and caffeine both very clearly can help with ADHD symptoms. There's pluses and minuses to using caffeine, and I've talked about that in that video. I can get into it more. Nicotine also has benefit, but clearly smoking it and vaping it has very significant health negatives. So probably chewing gum or patches are a safer way to go and probably a more precise dosing way to go with nicotine. So Ahmadi Ghulam Nawab Qadani is thinking methylphenidate and escitalopram, that he's been able to complete his graduation easily without much difficulty. So thanks for sharing that, and I'm glad it worked. So Scooty 1983 is thanking me on the Huberman episode and felt that it was one of his favorite Huberman episodes I've ever seen. I'll confess it's been out a week. I still haven't listened to it, but I've got one feedback from a supportive listener who did feel it was a good conversation, but it could have used a little more focus and organization, which that was my experience of it as we were talking, that it was a good conversation. And there were several topics we started, and I didn't bring the conversation back to finish the topic. Hello, Ben B. He's a year-long listener, and great that I don't remember seeing you asking questions before, so I'm glad you're here and commenting and questioning or asking a question. And this is a question about migraines and ADHD. Stimulants may cause migraines. Which ADHD medications can you take? So it's interesting. Stimulants can so at least for some people, part of the migraine process is vasospasm, arterial spasms in the walls of the artery constricting and interrupting blood flow, and stimulants can have effects on those little tiny muscles in the walls of arteries that can affect blood flow. On the other hand, they can be beneficial. So one of the most frequently prescribed by neurologists or recommended is, and I'm forgetting the name of the over-the-counter, Anacin plus, it's an aspirin plus caffeine. So caffeine is fairly often used for its vasoconstrictive, ability to affect blood vessels. So my understanding, and I'm not a migraine expert, and certainly consult with your doctors, is that it's not that stimulants are completely recommended against in the setting of migraine. It's to look at what works for you and your individual body and brain. So modafinil is less likely to have any vascular effects. So modafinil or Nuvigil, Provigil, Nuvigil, modafinil, and armodafinil may be an option for some people to treat their ADHD, with less likely to disrupt blood vessels and maybe trigger migraines. It's possible guanfacine, which actually is a blood pressure lowering agent, may be more benign, but I'm not aware of specific studies looking at safety, efficacy of those drugs for ADHD in the setting of migraine. And Max is sent a link to the video on my channel about dopamine and norepinephrine. So my critique is that, and I'm guilty of it, I do oversimplify. All science is oversimplifying, because otherwise science would be completely dead and finished. We're always oversimplifying or simplifying to some extent, because we're basing what we're saying on our knowledge to date. And hopefully in every field, from physics to biology, chemistry, psychology, biology, we are still learning more, and we are a work in process. But I do think some of the popular sort of use of, I'm down because my serotonin's off and I'm depressed, or I'm getting a hit of dopamine right now and I can feel the dopamine. That's a part that I don't know why it grates on me. And again, dopamine is absolutely centrally involved in reward processing and perceiving and assessing the value of, and the anticipated value of something you're going to get. But whether it's actually what you're feeling in that moment, that joy or that burst of connection, I'm not that convinced that it's actually dopamine. So I think we need to be careful in some of our storytelling. And Max is thankfully reminding me that I'm not making specific medical recommendations when I'm mentioning different supplements, or even talking about dosages or how quickly medications work. That consult with your own prescriber, but hopefully, as some people have already done, take the information here back to your doctor and invite them to the channel, because I know that many fellow psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists, social workers, coaches are actually listening to my channel, which is gratifying. So hopefully I make it accessible to non-professionals, and I'm hopefully answering questions that some professionals who haven't spent a lot of time working with ADHD may benefit from. So Sonorausol is taking Adderall. I'm diagnosed with ADHD a year ago. Adderall's made a huge difference, in Lexapro for generalized anxiety disorder. That's longstanding. And they were working on experimenting with weaning off the Lexapro. What results have seen in your experience? So I do have a talk on anxiety and ADHD, and there's overlap at lots of different levels. One is that they can be mistaken for each other when someone clearly really only has one, and they're told that they have the other. They can certainly have both going on, and there are clearly ways that anxiety can, and if you're really anxious, you can have troubles with concentration, you can have information processing problems, you can be less able to remember, more forgetful. So anxiety can replicate symptoms of ADHD, and ADHD probably at a deeper level can contribute to feeling anxious. So if you've had numerous situations where you missed social cues or you bumped into people or you blurted things out, then you are more wary of, am I about to make a mistake? Am I about to make a mistake that I wasn't even aware, and when I was making it was a mistake? So there are bidirectional connections there. So with that being said, with the specific question, I have had people who were treated for anxiety and on an SSRI, and then became aware of their ADHD and were treated for their ADHD. So I've had some people in that scenario who were able to successfully taper off their anti-anxiety SSRI and did so and didn't miss it. And I've had other people who, during the process, and again, unlike with ADHD symptoms, which respond quickly to stimulants like Adderall, and you should know in a day or two of stopping the Adderall, you should be able to see, oh, my ADHD symptoms are back. When you're tapering off an antidepressant, the commonest scenario is it takes at least a month or two off of it to know whether you're going to be free of your depression or free of your anxiety. So what's happening is you're tapering down may not tell the whole story. What happens even within a week or two after being off the Lexapro may not tell the whole story. You really need to be off of it a month or two at least to be sure that it wasn't really doing something that your brain needed to help you function better in the world and society. So I don't know if I answered direct. So I've had some people who, as they tapered down or after they got off, it was clear, yes, they really needed the Lexapro for mood or anxiety issues, that the stimulant alone wasn't enough. And I have had others who successfully got off of it, and that addressing the ADD itself was, and that stimulants can have some mood benefits, less commonly, again, direct anxiety benefits, but again, taking care of ADHD can certainly reduce anxiety. In terms of numbers, I don't have hard numbers, but my thought is that its recollections would be close to 50-50 in terms of the size of those two groups. So discontinuity is said after my dose and no side effects, and hasn't made any of their usual daily blunders, which might indicate it's working, but need to collect more data. So that's there, and thanks for the feedback. Paul Beal, I was surprised that a fitness influencer like Huberman would be open to stimulants. So I will I don't know what other products or substances and other videos. I've seen a few of his videos. I actually don't, in line with my talk on how to cope with Trump and how to get the right dose of your media, but also I do much more reading than I do video watching. So I don't know what other substances he's endorsed. I mean, there are certainly many people in the quote unquote fitness community or sports enhancement community. I mean, these are drugs that are banned by the Olympics because people do dope with stimulants to enhance performance. So the data on how well they help with enhancing performance is actually surprisingly limited and mixed, but I think there are probably, and not to stereotype or pick out, but there are clearly groups like nationalities, the Russians and other national sports organizations that have extensively researched, whether that's published or not, what may enhance performance in certain sports. So I think also that Andrew Huberman is maybe more nuanced than some of his detractors and fans would credit him for. So I think he does try to be aware of what the science is showing, and so he has a neuroscience by his own training and practice, and is there. I'll just leave it at that. James Alexander asks, why aren't more selective norepinephrine inhibitors like reboxetine used off-label for ADHD? Part of it is that there aren't in the US any other selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors available on or off-label. I mean, one of the jokes, so in the early 90s, when I finished my residency training, every year for at least 8 or 9 years, and in those days there still are big booths at the annual psychiatry meeting. It's the American Psychiatric Association. Used to draw 30 to 50,000 psychiatrists. It draws people from around the world, and many booths of the pharmaceutical industry. Year after year, reboxetine thought they were on the verge of getting approval in the US for depression, that it's going to be released. We're the only one who's a pure norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. It'll come out within the year. And they had their booth out there, and I'm not even remembering which drug company was trying to bring it to market, and eventually they abandoned it. The FDA said that data wasn't robust enough to show it worked as an antidepressant. It has been approved in other countries a lot. So why isn't it used more commonly off-label? And I talk about this more in the childhood antipsychotic, the risperidol, Abilify video. A huge amount of what happens in real life is doctors copying other doctors. They either learn something during training, they were 4 or 5 different SSRIs. People tend to use only 1 or 2 in their individual practice, and they tend to use what they were using in training or what they see other doctors use. And particularly for off-label use, most doctors are more wary about doing something off-label, but if they know their colleagues are all using an agent. So with the antipsychotics being used for ADHD, the risperidol and Abilify are clearly, in multiple studies, widely used in difficult cases of child ADHD, often with comorbid autism, tic disorder, maybe even psychotic disorders. Maybe some of that use is appropriate. I maintain that if you look at it, Abilify makes sense potentially as an ADD medication in the terms of the complicated ways it's regulating dopamine. Risperidol makes much less sense primarily in terms of dopamine. It's dopamine blocking, and in terms of side effect profile, it's much closer to having a high frequency of bad side effects. Abilify is at the good end. Again, it's not perfect for everyone. People do have bad side effects from either. So I think the establishment of risperidol so widely in childhood ADHD is because it's been approved for treating autism, and people keep using it and seeing that it's used and are more comfortable. So people prescribe because others are prescribing it and are comfortable with it. Again, I, for decades, have used duloxetine much more off-label for ADHD than I've used atomoxetine or Strattera. I have videos about both of those, but I do it because most people can take a therapeutic dose of Cymbalta is usually a tolerable dose. Most people can start at 30 or even 60 milligrams and get some benefit for ADHD on the first day. Again, with Strattera atomoxetine, most people need to start at 25 or lower and beyond that for weeks before they can tolerate going higher. And 25 is just not a therapeutic dose for most people. Again, individual doses vary. These aren't recommendations. And Max, thank you, provided links again for the anxiety and ADHD video on my channel. And Max is forwarding, and we have about 10 more minutes, so I'll keep the time in mind. A question on Reddit from Dow Jones Jr. 12. I've tried countless planners, apps, and calendars, only to abandon them after a week. How can I structure my day more effectively? So I do one of my very first, I think it's in the first dozen videos and probably needs upgrading, was on scheduling. So two different things. One of probably my biggest weakness, particularly in this modern age as a clinician, is that my phone sits on my desk most of the time. It's my work phone, it's my life phone, but I grew up in an era where people weren't attached or had phones, so I don't carry it with me. So anyway, my knowledge of which app is best for scheduling or best for long range planning or best for anything is rudimentary. Chad has a website, Attitude Magazine, Attitude Magazine, has a part of their website where they evaluate and recommend different specific apps. The other part of it is that it may be a particularly well-designed app, but if its color scheme doesn't speak to you, or you're used to having your calendars start with Monday rather than Sunday, and lots of these can be adjusted on different systems, I'm aware. But it has to be something that works for you and makes sense for you, and it may be really good. And if that doesn't matter, if it doesn't resonate with you. So a couple other things I would remind people, it's usually when they're trying something new, people with ADHD usually are excited and enthusiastic. Aha, this scheduler, this calendar system is going to really work for me. And that carries them through for a few days. And if it carried them through for probably a month or two, they'd have enough of a habit, enough of a pattern that they'd keep using it. But somewhere after the first week and before a habit is established is the sort of critical period for sticking with it to make it stick. So the other two things, one is you don't need a system that's perfect. And that seems to be one of the biggest barriers to people starting or pursuing, trying to find the perfect, the optimal system. I would argue, hopefully, you are a complicated and sophisticated enough person that no system is going to be perfect. There's always going to be something that doesn't exactly match how your brain works. You need a good enough system. You don't need a perfect system. Two, during that time of period when enthusiasm, initial excitement is waning, and before you have established a habit, that's the difficult part. And I think the most powerful tool there is social commitment, is getting a partner, getting a spouse, getting a kid, getting even a coworker to say, ask them, can you check in every day to see that I'm using my calendar? That may be weird. You may not have anyone in your life who can do that for you, but you probably do if you ask, because people around you probably appreciate and want you to learn to be more organized. So the other two things, or some of the other basics about a calendar system, one is it should be, some people are still using fewer and fewer these days, but old day planners. I used one for 30 years, fit in the pocket, everything could be written on it. It gives a concrete, you can see what you've done at the end of the day. So whatever you use, one, it should be one system, because if you have a separate calendar for this and a separate calendar for that, then things inevitably get dropped or missed from one to the other, and then it defeats the purpose of trying to know what you're going to do with it each day. Two, it should be portable. So I've had people who really liked having a whiteboard, and it may help to transfer each morning or each week, crucial items from your calendar to the whiteboard. But you want to, if you're out to lunch and you meet someone and they say, oh, let's meet up, next week at 6 and have a Zoom meeting to do this. And you're excited and you have a great idea, but I'll remember it when I get back to my wallet or back to my lab or back to my workplace or back home, and you forget it, and then you blow up the meeting, and then you're in trouble. So whether it's pen and paper, whether it's on your phone or PDA or whatever device you're using, it should be something that you're carrying with you all the time, because you don't know all of the opportunities you may have to put something into your schedule. So I hope that's a useful start. So James Alexander asks, how well do we understand how the non-stimulant medications affect monoamine levels in humans, given that pretty much the only direct measurement of how Qelbree affects them is in rats? So it's a good point that most of our most detailed and intricate experiments and research on our medications is often in rodent models, and rodents, rats, mice, hamsters don't always behave in all respects as human brains do. I mean, at least with atomoxetine, there certainly are, radioactive tracer studies looking at what it's doing with norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin in different brain regions. So there is some amount of research on sort of more widely used substances to show that at least to some extent they are working similar to what the rodent models are suggesting. But for drugs like Qelbree, which seem to be, let's just say, neurochemically in a class by itself, the studies that you need to get a drug approved by the FDA and some similar process in the European Union, you need to show that it's safe in people who have the condition and don't have the condition. You need to show that it's effective for reducing symptoms of whatever condition you're treating. And those studies are not directly showing anything about mechanism of action, but those studies themselves cost a few $1 million to conduct. And most drug companies, once they get approved, aren't interested in the intricacies of how it's working unless they think they can develop something else that's working along the same lines and have a longer patent life on it, for example. So a big driver of research is pharmaceutical companies, and there's not much inducement for them to be looking at what is going on at the neurochemical level in humans. So National Institutes of Health and Mental Health and other big government organizations, maybe we're doing away with all of that in our country right now, which would be quite scary and extremely short-sighted and, quite frankly, effing stupid. Not going to save money in the long run there. Anyway, I will step back from politics. So yes, there's a lot of interesting research that could be done that doesn't get done, that doesn't have the funding to do it. And a lot of what we know is through analogy to rodent models, but on the larger scale, and maybe not on all the fine details, but much of what we see in rodents seems to hold up and be true when many of these things are tested in humans. So Shul is asking about the concept of quest not test, also relevant and helpful for people without ADHD. So if I ever get around to it, I have a video on this. I used to call it task not test, but I think quest not test. So that's my philosophy for dealing with that very often people get stuck in the details, get stuck in making a test out of a situation when it's not the final test. It's not going to make or break you. It is one way you might have succeeded, but if you're blocked, then you can step back and figure out what your goal is. So quest not test, I think, is vital for everyone. I mean, it's not that dissimilar from a book that came out 30 years ago of Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff. I think quest not test is one, more proactive. So it's telling you what to focus on, and it's not dismissing everything as trivial, because I'm not saying it's all trivial. So I think it captures that old saying. So it's tremendously helpful for anger management. It's helpful in depression. It's helpful for anxiety. It's helpful for PTSD. It's helpful for a huge host of mental health issues or conditions, but I think it's helpful for the much broader spectrum of daily living and how to deal with life. And that is, again, focus on the quest, focus on your longer term journey, what you're striving for, what's in line with your goals and your values, and figure out ways, if you've been derailed or blocked or stymied, how to get back on track for that, rather than worrying that you got an F on this test, or you got rejected from this job opening, or this person didn't want to go on a second date with you. So thanks for the lead in there. Max gave a link to CHAD, the nationwide, so it stands for Children and Adults with ADHD. It's a nationwide organization. I think they do have some international branches, and they do have local chapters in most major U.S. cities. Most major U.S. cities also have local meetings and local references and resources. So it's initially a patient family centered group. So they've gotten some funding from drug companies, but it's not a shadow organization set up by drug companies. It's not set up by the medical powers that be. This was initially and continuing to be a patient and family generated network with good information. And Attitude Magazine also has generally well vetted and good resources on a variety of topics. So I do have to go, but I'll try to answer Sir Dar's question. What happens when Concerta helps with ADHD symptoms, but enhances anxiety? The very first step, my approach is always consider lowering the dose. I mean, it suggests you're being flooded with too much norepinephrine, which both your own anxiety and this drug are tapping into. So maybe dropping down a notch helps with ADHD, but doesn't kick off anxiety. Second approach is if the anxiety is manageable or low, and particularly if it's declining with time, it's likely to keep declining with time. One thing, stopping, starting, taking it a day, not the next day, is one of the best ways to continue to have side effects that are problematic rather than letting your body have a chance to adapt. So if it's manageable, it would be try to stick with that same dose, or if lowering the dose isn't the solution, stick with the dose for many days in a row to see if it's subsiding. And then the third place, this is one of the most commonly used scenarios for guanfacine, is stop the Concerta, start guanfacine, find what's a suitable dose for you for guanfacine. Guanfacine itself may be the whole ticket, may answer everything, but if not, most people who couldn't tolerate a stimulant before but were benefiting from it can once they are stable on guanfacine. It might not be the same dose you were trying before. So thanks for all the good questions. Thanks for being part of my 10,000 people family out here on YouTube. And thanks for reading my articles on Medium. If you read them there, I will be back next week. We'll keep doing this Tuesday question and answer. And stay healthy, stay happy, and try to stay sane in these crazy times.